Welcome online viewers. This is lecture number 9 in the series The 50 Years That Changed Painting. I'd like to thank Andrew Dyer and Donna Marie Kelly for their generosity in sponsoring this series and its transfer online, and also Tony Oates at the Drill Hall Gallery for having invited me to give this series of lectures. The terrible weight of numbers and the desperate odds faced by visual artists in 19th century France. We've acknowledged this as a chronic problem in previous lectures. These days, an exhibition consisting of 100 works is already considered a lot to take in during a single visit, and 150 works definitely excessive. However, consider the major showings of contemporary art back then. In the Salon of 1861 in Paris, 4,097 works were on view, selected out of a submission of more than 7,000. In 1874, 2,457 works exhibited in the Salon. An exhibition of international art created for the Universal Exhibition held in Paris in 1889 showed more than 2,700 works. Then the International Universal Exhibition of 1900. It was visited by 50 million people, and its pavilions represented more than 70 countries. 2 huge buildings were purpose-built for the Universal Exhibition to show paintings and sculptures. Paintings and sculptures without end, it would seem. There was a vast historical survey of French art from its origins to the beginning of the 19th century. There was a no less vast centenary exhibition of French art, compiled for the most part by a very remarkable cultural figurehead, Roger Marx. Roger Marx was a superb writer on art and artists. As the curator of the Centennial Survey, he was fair and inclusive, although not particularly given to extremism and subversion in his tastes and sympathies. But the survey he presented in 1900 was decidedly liberal in the best sense of the term. The official handbook for Roger Marx's survey lists 3,003 items, 672 paintings, 419 sculptures, 685 drawings, and other categories: miniatures, etching, lithography, woodcuts, decorative arts, medals, coins, furniture, architecture. In one wing of the Grand Palais, there was an exhibition of international contemporary art. Included in the Spanish contingent was a large subject painting, which is no longer in existence, called The Last Moments. It was a deathbed scene, and it was the work of a very young Spanish painter, only 19 years old, Pablo Picasso. Picasso and a group of his cronies from Barcelona made the trip to Paris to see the Universal Exhibition and to see Pablo's painting in situ. where it had not been singled out for glory as they might have hoped, but was pretty much lost in this ultra-competitive multitudinousness. It was Picasso's first trip to Paris and his first exposure to modern French painting. Roger Marx had made a large feature of the contribution of the French Impressionists. There were 14 paintings by Monet, 11 by Renoir, 8 by Sisley, 7 by Pissarro, 3 by Cezanne. It was the first time the Impressionists had been so conspicuously honored in an official exhibition. Furthermore, there were 13 paintings by Manet and 23 paintings by Corot, but conversely, stringent limits to the number of works by the Academy's hacks. One work by Jean-Paul Laurens, one minor work by Edouard de Taille, that's de Taille on the screen, versus one painting by Seurat and one by Gauguin. Clearly the rules of the game, the name of the game, seem to have changed, but these gigantic, ultra-competitive showcases for contemporary art were no doubt responsible, inadvertently so, in forcing changes that were now becoming so noticeable. Just being talented, technically accomplished, having an outsized ambition and a flair for showmanship, we know that the young Picasso had all of this going for him, but clearly it wasn't necessarily going to get anyone ahead. Moreover, professionalism, as it was then recognized, had become so standardized that it had created a pole of sameness and anonymity, goading the show-offs, the slick performers, and the would-be entertainers to jostle shamelessly for a place in the limelight. But the rules of the game and the name of the game were changing. There was a growing multitude of artists who opted to defect from the old game, who despised the success of the slick performers and their showy, meretricious tricks. Art for all, art for a large, undifferentiated public, art that was entirely outer-directed and calculated for effect, had become bad art, and even not really art at all. The weight of numbers and the desperate odds faced by artists wasn't a problem that would suddenly go away. The Salon des Indépendants was founded in 1884 as an alternative to the official salon with its slogan, "No jury, no prizes." But its showings were a plethora. In its initial exhibition were more than 5,000 works by more than 400 artists. In 1901, more than 1,000 works. In 1905, 4,269 works. In 1908, 6,701 works by 1,314 artists. The Armory Show was the first international survey of modern art ever held in the United States. It too was housed in an enormous building, which ensured that the more than 1,300 works on show weren't subjected to the crazy pile-ups typical of the Salon exhibitions, but still 1,300 works vying for your attention at once. What a dizzying challenge. The most detested artist in the Armory Show was unquestionably Matisse. Art students in Chicago burnt Matisse in effigy. The latest, most up-to-date phenomenon in art was, however, Cubism, a newfangled, inexplicable fad which seemed to have attracted many adherents. It wasn't the originators of Cubism, Picasso and Braque, who attracted the publicity. It was Marcel Duchamp's painting Nude Descending the Staircase, inspired by photographic studies of figures in motion, a painting strangely reminiscent of a photograph in its chiaroscuro and even dead surface, strangely photographic, strangely academic too, and quite unlike other Cubist works in this regard. The notoriety of the Nude Descending the Staircase became a worldwide phenomenon. The Australian artist Roland Wakelin remembered seeing it reproduced in a photo montage in a Sydney newspaper in 1913, the Sydney Sun, which for Wakelin announced the arrival of modern art in Australia. This is one of Braque's works in the Armory Show, a Cubist painting, a decent, perhaps somewhat unexceptional example of Cubism, but of zero interest to publicists and sensation seekers for obvious reasons. Compared to the bold, outward-directed stance which was not just necessary to succeed, not just necessary to be noticed, but was required just to be included or simply to survive in such a clamorous, competitive, showy environment. Braque's work isn't participating, isn't demonstrating any of the required characteristics. It does not seem to be communicating anything at all apart from the words that you can read: Mozart, Kubelik. Unattractively drab in color, bafflingly obscure in its figurative content, it proposes a poetics of introversion and withdrawal. The mood it connotes is morose, and, well, you can supply your own words for whatever mood it suggests to you. The American writer William Barrett said something very astute about the radical stratagems that modern artists had adopted. Our painting has detached itself from three-dimensional space, the arena of Western man's power and mobility, detached itself from the object, the supreme fixation of Western man's extroversion, and has become subjective, contrary to the whole tenor of Western life. Here, pictorial space, which we saw warping and buckling with Cezanne, which we saw silting up with the Impressionists and Neo-Impressionists, which Matisse and Derain more or less totally eradicated from their paintings, This is equated by Barrett with the arena of Western man's power and mobility. The object, whose separate existence, whose autonomy and coherence was likewise shattered many times over, is equated by Barrett with the supreme fixation of Western man's extroversion. What do these negations signify? What do they portend? Barrett wondered. Quote, is this merely malaise and revolt, or prophecy of a different spirit to come? I think artists would appreciate the way this question had been framed. There were 6 works by Picasso in the Armory Show, and really they were bits and bobs. This was the most substantial painting of his in the Armory Show. What were people supposed to make of a work like this, especially if they were aware that Picasso had appeared on the art scene in Paris in 1900, aged 19, brimming with an excess of confidence due to his academic prowess, due to his exceptional talent and facility, and then he could go on to produce a painting like this, an ugly, smashed-up face, manifestly clumsy, crude, seemingly without any education in the art of painting. It would have struck people as an act of self-immolation, abjuring the tricks the painter had learnt, hobbling his facility, renouncing any narcissistic desire to win admiration for pleasing, for entertaining, for profit. That was so ubiquitous, sickeningly and pathetically so, in these overpopulated, oversupplied marketplaces. There were other painters before Picasso and Braque who, in their distaste for the slickness and sameness of academic painting, opted deliberately to curb and preempt their facility. We've seen a lot of evidence of that before, of course. But there was now a degree of extremism, with a few great figures driven by a mixture of negationism, desperation, quandaries of not knowing, and an unshakable faith in their intuitive powers to find solutions. It was these artists who became exemplary during this era. There was a great deal of commonality between Cubism and Fauvism. Both Cubism and Fauvism inherited the rebel tradition of Primitivism, which in lecture number 5 in this series, we showed to be the flip side, or the dialectical opposite of academic classicism. Fauvism and Cubism both involved frank, emphatic assertions of painting's materiality. Both were fixated on the revelation of Cezanne and the conundrums that were still so fresh and intriguing in his work. Braque and Derain had been very much a part of Fauvism, but they and a few others too moved away from their Fauvist affiliation into a rapport with Picasso, from which Cubism as we know it was collectively developed. On the screen, the page of the catalogue showing entries for Braque in the 1908 Salon des Indépendants. You will notice the numbers assigned to his works already in the 900s. Braque was still exhibiting in the guise of a fauvist then, but it was the last time he did so. It was also the last time he participated in the Salon des Indépendants. You'll see that one of Braque's works has been lent by Daniel-Henry Kahnweiler, whose name is misspelt. Kahnweiler had recently opened a tiny gallery on the Rue Vignon, near La Madeleine, in the center of Paris. And he was to become the exclusive dealer and a very canny impresario of Picasso and Braque, not just of them, but also of Léger and Juan Gris, whom he very successfully marketed as the A-team of Cubism. Kahnweiler's strategy was to maintain the exclusivity of his gallery artists, mixing with the hoi polloi in the Salon des Indépendants and the Salon d'Automne was discouraged, if not positively forbidden. It is true that Braque submitted several paintings done in his recently adopted primitivist manner to the Salon d'Automne in 1908. But the jury rejected all but one of them, and Braque withdrew the painting they had accepted. All of the rejected works went on show in Braque's first one-man exhibition at Kahnweiler's gallery in November of that year. He never participated in the Salon d'Automne again. The poor showing of Picasso and Braque in the Armory Show in 1913 was attributable to Kahnweiler's unhelpfulness or obstruction, but in the long term, this strategy was incredibly effective. A division was established between the so-called painters of the Rue Vignon, which was Kahnweiler's gallery address, and the so-called Salon Cubists, who, by inference, were vulgarizers, popularizers, followers, imitators, inferiors. This marketing strategy worked wonders in the long term. 1908 was the termination date of Braque's fauvist affiliations and the beginning of a new initiative, which led to the extraordinarily productive, symbiotic relationship between his works and Picasso's, and for a while with Derain's as well. Braque spent the summer of 1908 in L'Estaque. The painting on the screen was painted there. As you see, it was harshly stylized and simplified in rapport with the direction that Derain's and Picasso's works were taking concurrently. L'Estaque was a fishing village situated on the edge of the Bay of Marseille. Braque had been there several times before. Derain had also painted there. However, L'Estaque was hallowed ground for them because of its association with Cezanne, whose fusions between the configuration of his landscape motifs and his meticulous organization of the pictorial surface, Braque was emulating, as is very clearly evident in these two paintings of the Chateau at La Roche-Guyon he painted the following year. The sharp-edged planes and crystalline shapes of the buildings are interspersed with a blur of greenery, which shifts in and out of focus. The play of contrasts, the dynamics, the fundamental language of classic Cubist painting has already been established. After Cezanne's death in 1906, and after his retrospective exhibition of 1907, more and more of his works were coming into the public eye, not just paintings, but also watercolors and drawings, which young artists were avidly studying. During Cezanne's lifetime, these two paintings wouldn't have been exhibitable in a respectable gallery because the canvas wasn't completely covered, which meant that they were unfinished, which meant that they were unexhibitable. However, in the new century, they took rank among Cezanne's masterpieces, magnificently resolved, exemplary compositions in their lucidity and coherence, and they became touchstones for Cubist painting. The way the motif is broken down into an arrangement of serried planes stacked in a configuration which rises the height of the canvas without deviating and slackening into an illusion of depth. It was both Cezanne's way of treating the motif and his choice of the motif itself that became paradigmatic for Cubist painting. Picasso and Braque sought out steep inclines clustered with buildings as places they wanted to paint. La Roche-Guyon, we've just seen. Also, the hillside of Montmartre, topped by the Sacré-Cœur. And this also determined their choices of holiday locations, hilltop towns, which in French are called villes perchées, perched towns, like Horta de Ebro in Spain and Céret in France. These are three paintings Picasso painted at Céret in 1911, and all of them resemble a ville perchée, aside from the fact that one is nominally a still life, one a figure, and one a landscape. The degree of abstraction common to them all makes the differences so tiny as to be almost negligible. All evoke a ville perchée, or perhaps we should reformulate the statement in reverse. The by now completely developed pictorial codes and rigorous syntax of Cubist painting, by now utterly confident in their autonomous reality and superb logic, have acquired an accidental similarity to the flanks of a ville perchée, its nature resembling art rather than art resembling nature. A year earlier, in 1910, Braque spent the summer once again in L'Estaque and returned with these two paintings, to all intents and purposes unidentifiable, without a subject, non-representational, abstract. And that same summer, in Cadaqués, on the Spanish Riviera, Picasso and his partner were holidaying together with Derain and his partner. On the left is a photo taken by Picasso of 4 canvases piled up together. These also very tenuously and equivocally related to any motif or subject you might guess. A friend and publicist of Picasso and Braque, who was a leading avant-garde poet, Guillaume Apollinaire, commented in 1912 on what was becoming a widespread phenomenon. Quote, "Many new painters limit themselves to pictures which have no real subjects, and the titles we find in the catalogues are like proper names, which designate men without characterizing them." This is a painting done by Derain in Cadaqués that summer of 1910. There's a common denominator, easy to identify, with the predilections of Picasso and Braque, but the contrast between them couldn't be more forcefully expressed than it is here, and it betokens a definitive parting of the ways. Yet Derain's contribution to the development of Cubism was crucial, and to understand it properly, we have to go back in time to the heady days when he and Matisse were the best of friends. Derain was in London during the spring of 1906 and was exchanging letters with Matisse. Long, intense, very thoughtful, very candid letters. Given where Picasso's and Braque's heads were at this early date, Derain's outlook, his sense of where modern painting seemed to be heading, was quite remarkable and helps us understand his role as an instigator of what was going to turn into Cubism. One particular letter is amazing, and the circumstances behind it color the contents in quite a significant way. Derain tells Matisse that he's just returned from his 5th visit to the British Museum. The British Museum in 1906 was organized very differently to what you can see there today. Like those dizzyingly large spectacles which had become habitual in Paris, the ambition of the British Museum was encyclopedic. Its displays well nigh exhaustive, and for a casual visitor, no doubt, exhausting. Piled up pell-mell, Derain recounted to Matisse, are Chinese, Negroes from Guinea and New Zealand, from Hawaii and the Congo, then ancient Assyrians, Etruscans, the Parthenon friezes, the Romans, Indians. During the height of European imperialism before World War I, the awesome scale of collecting, of appropriation, of ostentatious display knew no bounds. And this immersion in the diversity of the world's cultures was a background to Derain's ruminations in his letter to Matisse. It went without saying between Matisse and Derain that the art they were committed to wasn't mimetic. It wasn't based on empiricism, yet it remained tied to the world. It remained representational. But what did representation entail if it wasn't mimetic? Derain wondered. What I am driving at, he wrote, is that expression, that is to say, artistic expression, isn't in the object, but in how it's treated. The actual idea, that is to say, the essential artistic concept, the gist of a work of art, is in the way of exploiting one's means. That is to say, how one treats, how one interprets, how one renders the work subjective. Moreover, Derain continues, in recent times, we've all had an extraordinary revelation relating to art in the discovery of the world of matter, which lives in us according to our inclinations through the spirit of transposition. We are perhaps a happy generation in that we are perhaps the only ones who have realized that stone, color, no matter what materials are pleasing to the human spirit, have their own life, independent of what they are made to represent. What happens among the primitives, and here, of course, the primitives Derain refers to are extremely diverse culturally and historically. What happens among the primitives is the complete union between the spirit emanated by colored matter and the physical situation or objective representation. These are images of a mental state. They aren't harmonies, that's to say, they aren't a parallel to the natural physical situation, whatever that may be, unquote. This notion of primitivism that Derain articulates at this time makes him an avid enthusiast and collector of African sculpture, which he appreciates because they're non-mimetic, they're conceptual, they're metaphorical, and because their makers show great respect and sensitivity towards the intrinsic qualities of their materials. It was Derain more than anyone else who encouraged Picasso to share in these enthusiasms and to adopt similar convictions. According to one version of the tale, it was Derain who actually took Picasso to see the ethnographic collection of the Trocadero Museum in Paris, a life-changing event for Picasso and a foundational event in the history of Cubism. According to another version of the story, Picasso went there on his own. At least there was no mention of Derain. The collection of the Trocadero Museum was another one of those vast, encyclopedic, imperialistic displays. It was a creepy place. It made Picasso queasy. Quote, "There was a smell of mold and desolation that went straight to my throat. I was so depressed, I wanted to leave at once, but I forced myself to stay to examine the masks and all the things men had made to sacred designs, which served as intermediaries between them and the unknown, hostile forces that surrounded them. The day I understood this was when I found my way." Unquote. The other version of this tale that appears to quote Picasso verbatim adds the following: "Les demoiselles d'Avignon should have arrived on that very day, not because of the forms, that is to say, not because of any formal correspondence or derivation, but because it was my first painting of exorcism." These eyewitness accounts, which are unique and have been justifiably quoted and re-quoted by almost everyone, need to be approached with a bit of caution. Both of them were very likely written down quite long after the telling, and they were published, one in 1964, the other in 1974, a very long time after the summer of 1907, when this life-changing encounter took place. And what exactly did Picasso think he was exorcising? The artifacts in the Trocadero Museum, which he called fetishes, were, he said, weapons that help people escape from their subjection to spirits and to make themselves independent. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon wasn't just a consequence of Picasso's visit to the Trocadero Museum. It was a consequence of his responses to works by Matisse and Derain. It was a consequence of his response to the revelation of Cezanne in the memorial exhibition of 1907, when Cezanne's monumental bathers compositions came into view. It was a consequence of many other factors as well, all converging to produce an explosive result. Consequently, the great purge or the great crack-up affected in Picasso's art can be seen from many different aspects. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon makes a radical feature of fragmentation, extreme discordancy, and jarring stylistic inconsistency. The hard edges and clear shapes connote the shattering and disruption of what is being presented, on the face of it, a contrived tableau, something like a harshly lit shop window display, or something like a scene in a waxwork museum. Again, what is being exorcised? Conventional classical ideas of beauty and harmony, every shred of realism, naturalism, impressionism, photographic likeness, Eurocentrism and whiteness, and everybody ought to recognize this. Yes, Eurocentrism and whiteness, they are being exercised. The elitism of the fine arts, the presumed stability and continuity of tradition and heritage, the commodity status of the work of art, all are being called into question in the most uncompromising manner. And in addition, there was also the phenomenon of self-immolation we referred to earlier, the academic training, the technical brilliance, knowing how to impress and please your peers, etc. All of this seems to land on the cutting room floor or to hit the proverbial fan. One assiduous visitor to the Armory Show in New York was the poet Wallace Stevens. His fascination with the modern painting he encountered there proved to be transformational. It transformed Stevens into a great modernist poet. His insights into the affinities between painting and poetry became the basis of an essay called The Relations Between Poetry and Painting. It's quite a strange thing to read, but there's a very arresting statement near the end, which leads us to a realization I don't think we can ignore when we're looking at Cubism. Modern reality is a reality of decreation. Stevens doesn't use the word destruction, but decreation. And it's modern reality, not simply painting or poetry associated with decreation, even though we know that it's poetry and painting he's referring to. So what is this word decreation, which seems so tantalizingly appropriate to our understanding of Cubism? Stevens found the concept of decreation in the writings of the French philosopher and mystic Simone Weil, who died in 1943. According to her, decreation is a passing or a shuttling or an opening up between creation and the uncreated. Decreation isn't the same thing as destruction, which is a motion going from creation to nothingness. Destruction is nihilism. Decreation is not. For Simone Weil, decreation equates with a mystical transit from one state of consciousness to another. It is a way of knowing God. Whereas for Stevens, a skeptic, the concept of decreation doesn't belong to mysticism or religion. He makes his difference with Simone Weil clear. Decreation involves the uncreated or increate in the sense that the increate is potential, immanence, virtuality, capital B, being, which we catch a glimpse of, so to speak, when an illusion breaks up and its components are riven with gaps and lacunae. But this word becomes even more apposite when we discover that for Simone Weil, the idea of decreation hardly pertains to aesthetics. She connects it with ideas of the self and of society. For her, the self is considered to be an oppressive construct imposed on us by society. To free oneself, this conscious, controlling, conventional, limited individualism needs to be dismantled somehow, or evaded, or outwitted. Once again, for an artist like Stevens, This doesn't come down to a matter of belief, but pertains to the mental adjustment necessary to the spiritual preparation required by the modern artist. Unlike their predecessors, unlike a vainglorious egotist like Edouard de Taille, for instance, modern artists didn't comply with what artists were expected to be. The self-immolation of Picasso is a spectacular example, but by no means a unique or isolated case. In modern poetry, there's a parallel in the decreative stance propagated by Arthur Rimbaud, who famously proclaimed, "Le je est un autre," the I is another, and called for a dérèglement de tous les sens, a disordering of all the senses, as the prerequisite for inspiration to be summoned and true creativity to flow. Our revelations are not the revelations of belief, but the precious portents of our powers. Over quite a long time, Picasso and Braque developed a symbiotic relationship to such an extent that their works became virtually indistinguishable from one another. Neither of them would sign or date their paintings, at least not on the front of the canvas. This protracted experiment in intersubjectivity or in impersonality and self-effacement was brilliantly successful. Between 1910 and about 1913, neither Picasso nor Braque seemed able to put a foot wrong, and together they achieved a body of Cubist works, paintings, drawings, collages, sculpture, prints, which in every respect were summits of modern art. Picasso and I were engaged in what we felt was a search for anonymous personality, Braque explained. We were inclined to efface our own personalities, to find originality. That it often happened that amateurs mistook Picasso's painting for mine, or mine for Picasso's. This was a matter of indifference to us. The ethos of self-effacement, the quest for the anonymous personality, the poetics of introspection and withdrawal is one side of the Cubist phenomenon, but there's another side that couldn't be more of a contrast. Publicity-seeking, controversy, scandal was the other side. In 1910, there appeared an article by an American journalist, Gelett Burgess, published in the magazine The Architectural Record. This was an exposé of the mad, mad world of contemporary art in Paris, where things were going haywire. Those libertarian showcases, the Salon des Indépendants and the Salon d'Automne, were attracting crazy painters and sculptors by the dozen, and Parisians were flocking there to laugh at them. Gelett Burgess had done the rounds and gone to visit the main perpetrators in their studios, and he'd photographed them and some of their works in situ. We've already seen a couple of his photos. I should remind you that the Armory Show was 3 years hence, and Roger Fry's post-impressionist show in London was yet to come. So Gelett Burgess's exposé was near the very beginning of the shocked, scandalized reception of modern art. Burgess acknowledged Matisse as his perpetrator number one. Quote, "It was Matisse who took the first step into the undiscovered land of the ugly. When he paints his wife with a broad stripe of green down her nose, though it startlingly suggests her, it is his punishment to have made her appear so." And so the game is on, the new game. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the most outrageous of us all? Whose effrontery takes the cake? And, of course, the winner, hands down, is Picasso. When Gelett Burgess visits him, he's still living in a slum tenement of artist studios in Montmartre, known as the Bateau Lavoir, and he's 29 years old and still looks like an adolescent. In the studio, Burgess sees 2 whopping canvases, which he photographs: Les Demoiselles d'Avignon and 3 women, both of them painted in 1908. 3 women may have been in the studio, or Burgess may have seen it and photographed it in the apartment in Montparnasse belonging to the American collectors Leo and Gertrude Stein, because the Steins bought it in 1909, and their outlandish collection of modern art, including some of the most extreme paintings by Matisse and Picasso, was one of the must-see attractions for Americans in Paris. The photo Burgess took of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon contributed to this painting's notoriety, while it remained in effect Picasso's unknown masterpiece. It wasn't exhibited in public until 1916, when it remained on view a mere 15 days. That was the only time it was shown in public in France, before it was packed off to the United States in 1937. Burgess described Picasso's slummy domicile littered with a mixture of rubbish and valuables. There was no electric lighting, not even gas. The source of studio lighting was a kerosene lamp, and there were pictures that could raise your hair. Quote, "Picasso is colossal in his audacity. Picasso is the doubly distilled ultimate. His canvases fairly reek with the insolence of youth. They outrage nature, tradition, decency. They are abominable. You ask him if he uses models, and he turns to you a dancing eye. Where would I get them?" grins Picasso as he winks at his ultramarine ogresses. And so the Picasso legend was born. Thanks for your interest. See you soon.